Well, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. A pleasure, sorry. I never get that one right. I really don't know. So look, everybody here knows that the government has made a commitment to science. You've been talking about this all day. And we know it's done so in many ways by appointing a Minister of Science and a Chief Science Advisor. And I guess I'd argue in today's world of complex issues that include climate change, fisheries, public health, space, the list is almost endless, most would agree that science has a role in supporting political decision-making. And the role of science becomes particularly important today, given this government's commitment to and investment in science, research, and innovation for the future. So how are we doing? Do the politicians appropriately value science and integrate it into their decision-making? Within the public service, are we witnessing a shift in mindset and practice that engages science at the beginning of policy and program discussions? And in a world where information is growing, is the government science community ready, willing, and able to drive government agendas such as policymaking and regulatory reform? So to help us unpack these issues around the role of science advice, government, and the political process, I'm joined by three panelists. On my immediate right is Donna Kirkwood, who is the Chief Scientist at Natural Resources Canada. Sarah Gallagher is the first Chief Science Advisor for the Canadian Space Agency, next over. And Dan Wehner is recently appointed Chief Science Advisor for the National Research Council. So the format is fairly straightforward. I will sit down because there's no way I could possibly stand for this long. And we're going to have a conversation among the three of them. I will pose one question that I'm going to ask each of them to answer, and then we'll just have a to and fro from the podium here, from the table here. And then I'm going to open it up to you, and we'll have a discussion from the floor. So time is just a chimera, of course, of bourgeois capitalist existence. So we will run this until we decide we've had enough. I'm not particularly held by the clock, and I hope none of you are here as well. I know we got a late start due to the ups and downs of the elevators. Thank you, Jeff, for that. So, make sure we're on. 1, 2, good. So as I said, we're going to start by asking each of the three panelists to answer this one question, and then a little bit of discussion up here on a number of issues, and then I will ask you to contribute. So, Donna, starting with you. We live in a postmodern world where I think it would be agreed that facts are hard to agree upon, whether scientific or about the size of the crowds at Trump's inauguration. And it does seem sometimes, in all seriousness, that the political process is driven by everything except solid data. In fact, there's a fascinating model put out by the Institute on Governance or Government in Ottawa U that talks about how politicians make decision-making, and interestingly, data and information is not on their list. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but if you have a government that has clearly stated it supports science-driven decision-making, what are the challenges to getting government to value and integrate science into its decision-making from your perspective?
Thank you, Toby, and thanks for having me here today to speak about a subject that I can go on and on and on and on about. First off, I'd say for the government to value science, I do not see there's a challenge there. Where I see there is a greater challenge is integrating science into decision-making. And we'll have the opportunity to touch on this during the panel. So first off, I'll just speak quickly about the role of science in federal governments. Like I always do things in three clear roles. First off is science for public good. In Natural Resources Canada, for example, the science that we need to understand the state of the forests. Responsibilities that are federal responsibilities at the federal level, where the science and the products of science are value for Canada and for the country. Second off is the science that is a bit more focused towards either regulatory issues, standards, laws, policies, or technological developments like in Natural Resources Canada. So specific areas where the government wants to really push the science. And different federal departments have more or less of those functions. And last but not least is where I would say probably the federal science distinguishes itself the most from academic science, is that science advice to politicians. Like we tend to say, you know, the value of science, but what is the science advice on a specific issue? And that sometimes goes on behind closed doors, and we all understand why. So those are the three key roles. The reason why there's difficulty in integrating that science into decision-making, I do really believe it's the pace. We all understand that policy making, government agendas change based on context, and we have seen more than enough changes that Canada has faced during this current mandate, right? We can all think of a few. So that, policy and program development is really quick, and we have to react quickly. And we all know also that science, science programming, when you're a scientist, you plan 5-10 years out. So that pace, which is quite different, doesn't help integrating the science advice. Now, it's up to both communities, the policy community and the science community, to understand that. It's important to feed the right information at the right time. And I would say key to that, and I can speak more to that on your other questions, key to that is enabling relationships between the science community and the policy community, and ensuring that within each federal department, there's a clear vision of what the role of the mandate or the role of the department is, and that vision is shared across the whole department. So that when whoever is called in to provide advice, be it economic, be it social, be it natural physical sciences or policy, we know why we're providing that advice, and we're already part of a conversation.
Thank you. Sarah.
So I'd like to go back to one thing that Donna said in terms of science for the public good as an example for the state of the forests. And I think one of the important parts of science is just having access to the appropriate data. And actually a lot of the data that goes into the decision making that happens in her department is data that comes from space. And so there's this essential infrastructure that a lot of the government departments depend on, which is the space infrastructure that allows you to study the state of the water table, if there's disasters, if you see the landscape moving because of mining or something like that. All that sort of information is accessible from space. So it's, in terms of being able to integrate science appropriately in decision making, it's absolutely essential that you actually have the appropriate data that you need, which relies on the infrastructure of the data gathering, much of which comes from satellites that relay that kind of data. So I think that's really essential, that you have the appropriate data you need in order to make the assessments. So if you have the data, then you need to be able to interpret it and convey that information to the people who actually need to know it. And in this case, I think the point that Donna made also about policy versus science and the different pace of them is absolutely true. There's a certain uncertainty that scientists really are adamant about defining. They don't want to say something until they're really, really sure about it, but often you have to make decisions before you're able to beat down that uncertainty, which a lot of scientists are very, very uncomfortable with. I think one possibility, for example, to reconcile the sort of the conservatism to some extent of scientists in terms of being able to make definitive statements, and also just the necessity to make decisions on much shorter timescale, is, for example, if you have policy teams, is to have a scientist that's embedded in them, so that you have somebody with the capacity who can actually integrate that scientific data, share it in a digestible form with their colleagues, and so that data can be incorporated where it needs to be at the same time. Rather than bringing in expertise or passing things along from on high, if you actually have scientifically trained people within policymaking teams, then that can really help because they've already developed a rapport with their colleagues and they can really translate that data. And so I think that also goes to exactly what she was saying about it's how important it is to have relationships between scientists and policymakers so that you can integrate the scientific data at every step in the decision-making process rather than just sort of inserting it when you think it might be necessary, which may not be at the appropriate moment.
And so, Dan, what do you see as the challenges of getting government to value and integrate science in decision-making?
Well, first, thank you for the opportunity to talk. It's really hard to improve on the first couple answers, so I'm going to take it maybe in a slightly different direction. I think it's very important, if we're going to integrate science into decision-making, that we learn how to communicate what science is more effectively to those who are making decisions. Scientists are really good at communicating with each other, not so good at communicating with people, those who are not scientists, and most of the decision makers are not scientists. So I think it's going to be very important for us to think more carefully about how we actually communicate what it means. So when your neighbor asks you what you do if you're a scientist, they don't actually care really what you do. What they really are asking is, what is it good for? How is it going to have an impact on my life? And that's the kind of conversations that we need to be able to have with decision makers as well. And that is, we need to be able to condense the meaning of a scientific outcome or result or a body of evidence into something that they can actually understand for a decision. Now, I'm going to go to a different topic, and that's, we talked about the pace of change, and Donna, you're right, that things are happening so fast. Technologies are coming onto the market faster than we know how to understand their impacts and implications. But so is information. There is a Moore's law of data. Data is doubling every 18 to 24 months, and it's getting harder and harder for us to assemble all the data that's available that may or may not be needed to understand what the basis for a decision. So that becomes more and more of an issue, and so although and I'm going to maybe say that I'll say one more thing, and then I'll try to tie it together. The third thing that I see is technologies and information that are cutting across current departments and the intrinsic siloed nature of government departments that we still see. We've been talking about all the government approaches for as long as I can remember, but it's still pretty siloed from my perspective. And so how are we dealing with digitization or digitalization of various sectors? And how are we actually, instead of having each department think through what AI is going to do for their sectors, how are we actually bringing that up to the level of, and now I'm going to look at across the table at all of us, what is our role in helping to stimulate the conversation that cuts across departmental lines and gets to the heart of how are we actually thinking collectively about one of the issues, digitalization and AI. What is the appetite and ability for governments to actually be consumers of these technologies rather than what's the policy for AI? How are we using AI for policy? Really interesting question. So to me, as I sit where I am right now, I look across and see communicating is critical, managing the pace of change, and understanding not how to integrate evidence into a departmental decision, but how we actually integrate across departments and across government.
So help me work through this, because the three of you are, I think, talking in an environment where, as I said in the introduction, government has acknowledged the importance of science. And the regret of being the oldest guy in the room is I can remember a government that didn't. And there are governments that don't. And so how do you're talking effective ways to deal with politicians who at least have publicly stated they're open, but what do you do in a world where the political world may be saying, you know what, we really don't care? Is that just a matter of continuing to do the work, Or how do you make science for the public good effective? How do you ensure that it gets integrated into a policy world? Want to give it a try? You have a good time?
Yeah, well, for sure. I'll change the question a bit.
I was the one who used to work for the CBC, and I told her this trick.
For those that know me, they know this that I pull this trick often. I would say we have right now, here and today, a golden opportunity to demonstrate the value of science. It's upon us to demonstrate that and to demonstrate the value, and so that if the political context changes, we will have convinced more and more people, this is the naive and optimistic Donna speaking, that there is value to science. So I'm more of that world. There are many things going on right now that when you are within a department, and I'm sure my two colleagues will learn soon, we are seeing changes right now. It is driven from the highest levels all the way down. Conversations within our own department and across departments are happening more and more. I see some colleagues here that are coordinating conversations on quantum, for example. There is a deputy minister committee that has gagné des galons and is important and is meeting regularly. The champion of the committee is Janet King here. And they are discussing these cross-cutting, horizontal issues that touch on science. So, you know, we are making a difference currently. We are discussing around that table and within departments issues such as artificial intelligence. So let's ensure, I talked about relationships, let's ensure that those relationships that we maintain them, and that we keep facilitating and enabling those conversations within departments and across departments, and I would even say the broader collective. This government is all about ensuring everyone that is part of the science enterprise in Canada is part of the conversation. So we're working towards that. I certainly have seen changes at my level, and I'm sure the scientists in my department would say they are seeing those changes. So for me, we have the political context we currently have. It's up to us to make the most of that right now and to demonstrate to everyone the value of science.
And one of those ways is through integration and cross-cutting work on issues. So how are we doing on that one?
So I started my job 5 weeks ago. So I'm not going to give anyone a report card on that. What I would like to say is my experience of being in the Canadian Space Agency for 5 weeks and really having a fantastic opportunity as a new person in the environment with a scientific background. My scientific background is in space astronomy. And I have had the opportunity to meet with people in every single department within the Canadian Space Agency and hear about the fantastic and exciting work that's happening in all of them. And with this role, as somebody who's a little bit lateral within the organization, but has access to all the different levels of it, I can already see just tremendous synergies possible synergies within the space agency. I mean, there are lots of different groups that work with big data, that need to do image analysis, that are trying to develop similar technologies, and so there's lots of really fantastic opportunities for synergies, and that's just within a single department. And I think it's absolutely the case, as both Dan and Donna mentioned, that should be happening between departments as well, and that we should be collectively sharing our wisdom, and also recognize that there are going to be certain communities that are really on the cutting edge of specific issues, and that and you want them to share their expertise with everybody else. You don't have to reinvent the wheel more than once, especially because some people are likely to reinvent a really lousy wheel, and we all want good wheels. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that there are other institutions within the country that we want to participate as well. So universities, for example, are structured in very different ways from the government, and so there's an opportunity within the university community, people that might be in different government departments might be in close contact within universities. There are professional societies where the same sort of thing happens. So those institutions outside of the government can also help that do have true investment and definitely value science, can also help the country overall be a little more robust against what could happen on the top political level.
And are you saying that government science has a role in engaging those players in the political process?
Absolutely. I think, I mean, if you look at a really healthy scientific community, it has pillars of industry and the government and also universities, academic researchers, and you definitely want those three to be working together. And especially if they are working together, it makes them more robust to what could be happening on the top political level.
So the integration story is important. Dan, from your perspective, what would you be saying on that one?
Well, I have a tendency sometimes to speak in axioms. So first of all, I would say to the first part of the question around, let's just recognize that governments come and go, policies ebb and flow. But the job of the public servant is to be courageous, to speak truth to power. If we have data, we have information that is irrefutable, then it's our job as public servants to speak that truth. And so I just want to encourage anyone who's in the public service, whether you're a scientist or in some other policy job, that's our job. Our job is to be courageous, and most of us embrace that. I would also say that another one of my favorite axioms, you can't reason somebody out of a position they haven't reasoned themselves into. So it is a fool's errand to try. And so if you're faced with unreasoned positions, then my experience is the more facts you provide, the more outraged people get. But it is still our job to provide those facts. And then the last thing I'll say is something we were talking about earlier, and that is that when we're talking about relationships, we need to understand that there aren't processes that can replace relationships. You cannot replace a relationship with a process. It is also our job, especially in the more senior part of the public service, to establish those relationships with our political masters, and to develop a trust and to develop places where we can be safe and speak our minds. And that's part of an art, but it also is very important for us to recognize that is the relationships that ultimately are going to be influential and create the openness, I think, to really looking at data that comes, or information that comes from a science base.
So let me try it back at you. You're saying that the truth to power story is about providing facts even if there's not great interest, if you like. I'm deliberately being a little simplistic.
Active dissuasion.
Okay. So what about if you disagree with the policy direction of the government? What's the role?
Well, that's a really interesting, challenging question, because our job is not to, my job is not to judge the policy. My job is to provide information that supports a evidence-based decision, irrespective of the policy. And if I find myself in a position where I can't do my job because I disagree with the policy, I have to leave.
Want to pick up on that? Or you're agreeing?
I'm agreeing. I couldn't have said it any better, but it is, in just talking with the scientists within my department and other departments, it's the toughest thing to understand, is that there's your scientific background, your own personal values, and what we call in public service our democratic values. You provide advice, the best advice possible, and you try and certainly try and not let your personal opinions interfere with your scientific advice. And when you have conversations with scientists about that, they understand. They also realize that if they cross that line, at some point they can get in more trouble than less. And it's all about ensuring you provide the advice, of course, the most rigorous, relevant advice that you can, the most credible, at the right moment, in the right way. And once you've done that, it's up to someone else to make a decision. And also reminding scientists that there's not just, the physical and natural sciences and the science that weighs into a decision. There are other factors, right? So yes, speaking truth to power, the honest broker role is how we call it. And as long as you're able to provide that advice and the right science and the facts, then it's up to someone else to make a decision.
Great. So it's not just about providing the facts. It is about providing advice based on them, no? As
Yes.
part of the policy process?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, our title is advisor, right? So yes, absolutely, that's what we're supposed to do. I'd also like to return a little bit to something that Donna said is, and agree with what Dan said, is that it is important that you, if you absolutely can't function within the environment you are, that I think you do have an obligation to leave. My position, the way it was set up, is actually, I think, by its very nature, allows me to be quite independent because I'm still a professor at Western University. That's half my job, and as well as being the science advisor to the Canadian Space Agency. So that does, I'm not beholden. I mean, if the Space Agency fires me, I still have a job. I hope they don't. I'm having a great time. But that does give me a level of freedom that somebody within the government service who's a lifetime public servant might not have. So I think that does show confidence and a real demonstration that they want independent advice. That's what the Space Agency is asking for. And so that is one way to give people who are functioning as advisors some autonomy if they have, if they are coming from outside.
So all three of you have talked about integrating and working across silos and sectors and the like. How good are we as this government science community at doing that, at driving those kind of relationships necessary to work with other sectors toward the innovation economy? And if we could do better, what should we be doing? You want to start, Dan?
Do I want to start?
Thank you, Dan. Just kidding.
I think we're actually, there are places where we're really good, and there are other places where I think that we need to learn from others. Maybe that's the nicest way to say it. So, but there are initiatives, for example, the Federal S&T Infrastructure Initiative, which I see is creating a huge collaborative spirit across many departments to think about how we actually build, for example, common infrastructure. I think there are many benefits to pay from having a single facility that's used by many departments, because you don't know what's going to happen when scientists start talking to each other, and the main job of a manager really needs to be to create it and then get out of the way. So I think that there is a spirit, especially at the level of scientists, that they understand the need and the opportunity to collaborate and to build those bridges. And I'm seeing spirit at all levels right now of government to move in those directions. So I'm really feeling encouraged, and I might not have said that 15 years ago if you had asked me that question.
What about other sectors, academic and private? What role do they play, and what role do we play? Does government play, perhaps more to the point, in helping to drive a shared direction, if that indeed is the role?
I'd almost want to just sort of look to Sarah to tackle that one, but it's in part because I come from an organization that is working right now, for example, to build stronger bridges with academia. Right. The problems that we have to solve today, wherever we are too complex for any one person, group, organization to deal with. Right. And that the challenge then is to build the appropriate collaborations that pull together universities, government labs, industry as needed to actually work together to tackle the problems. I think the challenge that we face is, and I'm going to almost ask you a question now, Toby, but the challenge that we face is building the appropriate governance structures that actually allow cross-cultural collaboration to take place, because an academic culture is really different from an industry or or a government, a federal culture. I used to publish in the same journals, go to the same conferences, so I thought we were the same. And then I went to set up the National Institute of Nanotechnology in Edmonton and discovered that I did not understand this world, because it was a different culture. And so I think that one of the challenges is government working with government, I see working because there is a common thread of culture in the way that we approach it.
That's interesting.
But I think that the payoff's going to be able to bring all three pillars of the research enterprise together. And I don't think that we're really good at governing those collaborations yet.
And huge pressures, aren't they? I mean, because the pressures to go back to internal to government, the silos, is huge. I mean, the road is littered with interjurisdictional and cross-departmental
But
collaborative
remember,
arrangements that never last very long.
Silos are behavior. So you can't change silos by changing structure, changing processes. It's a behavioral issue. And it's a natural one. That's why we build moats around castles.
Okay. Sorry.
So I'm going to reframe a little bit what Dan said. I think this is sort of the issue of interdisciplinarity, really, where you want to bring people from different disciplines together. And I think there's two ways to combat it. One is that you have a common problem where the expertise that you need is quite obvious, and you can bring people together to solve a problem. And if they care about solving that problem, then they're going to work together to solve that problem. And I think there's a lot of examples of government priorities that are problems that people really want to tackle, and you're going to have committed individuals who value fixing things, and they're going to get together and work on it. The other way you can develop interdisciplinarity is just by bringing people together and essentially letting them hang out. And if they have a relationship, they will often find common ground, but that is really hard to force unless you bring people together who want to work together. So I have a fantastic collaboration with someone who's in the room, Mark Daly, and we wound up collaborating because we were working together as part of a pedagogical reading group because we both really care about teaching, and then we got to talking and converted that relationship into co-supervising a student who was using machine learning to study supermassive black holes. So those things are not directly related, but the reason it happened and it was so fantastically successful was that we had a relationship, and we naturally were a fantastic team in supervising this student. So I think you can promote disciplinarity in both ways, both through putting together, getting people together to focus on a problem that they really care about, and then also just bringing people together, and they will often find common ground.
I'll touch on a different aspect and trying to tap into the group here a bit more of what role can the policy community play. I was thinking a lot about making my way up in public service and leadership courses and talking about competencies, and I remember with my scientist mind in those leadership courses talking about, well, we will have to solve complex problems in the future, and we will need people and public servants with different competencies. And as a scientist, I think I wasn't getting it. I was like, well, yeah, we know they're complex problems, and we just need interdisciplinarity. But more and more, in trying to bring and bridge the policy and the science community together in Natural Resources Canada, I'm realizing it's about the competencies of the people. I talked about the relationships, and this is really, really important, and we see it more and more with the younger people coming in the departments, with those collaboration skills, the networking capacities, being able to bridge and go across. So it's not so much bringing the right experts with the right disciplines together. It is also ensuring that in public service we have people that realize first, the benefits of bringing folks together, a team to focus on an issue, interdisciplinarity, but also working together. And it works for everyone. So what do you need? What are the skills and competencies we need to be able to enable these relationships and these conversations to happen between the fast-paced and the slower-paced? I call it sometimes fast food, slow food. But, it's all about the people. And I think, we should certainly focus a lot more on how we develop our people if we want them to enable these collaborative relationships, regardless if they're with universities, industry, policy analysts, or communicators, right, or politicians. It's much more about being able or enabling our folks to cut across whatever barriers they have to cut across.
So what skills do you expect from the policy community? And do you see them?
Oh, yeah, they're everywhere, you know.
No, the ones you need, I mean.
You also have to lead by example, right? You have to demonstrate what are those competencies and the skills people will learn. You have to enable people. You have to give them the potential, the possibilities to innovate, to think outside the box, to be able to, in our very public service world of, it's okay to reach across to a colleague. You don't have to go up the chain through your boss to the other boss and back down. You know, we have to get better at just collaborating and talking, okay. and understanding, of course.
Wayne, either of you? No? So the risk in this conversation is I am not a scientist. The most scientific challenge I had to face the other day was making a cup of espresso. I don't hear anything around social sciences in this conversation. So where do the social sciences fit in the kind of paradigms that you've been talking about? Do you guys interact with them? Do they make a difference? How do they play in your decision-making? Do they make a difference in your decision-making, or are they just another group of people sitting out there?
No, social scientists are actually a critical part of the world that we live in now. If you read Shirk's document on imagining Canada's future, there's just a little piece in there about technology, and most of it is actually about the social impacts of change. So science is part of what's driving change. It's not the only thing that's driving change, but it isn't you know, something, it just didn't magically happen that social scientists have been involved in genetics and genomics-based research, or that social scientists more and more are involved in nano-related things. And I think it's really important for us to deal with public acceptance of emerging technologies and to engage the social sciences community to actually have scholarly discussions as well as practical communicative discussions about what are the impacts. And I don't think that scientists in general are best placed to have those conversations. And so from my perspective, we had a great relationship and still do with Shirk and with other parts. I see Monica sitting here, and there are a number of people in this community that I believe are really critical. I would like to say that we should, as we build technology, I'm going to say disruptive innovation agendas, that we engage social scientists at the beginning and not have it wait until we are at a point where we're ready to release a technology and we say, oh, I wonder what's going to happen when the public hears about this.
So how do you do that from where you sit? How do you do that from where you sit, Donna? I mean, is that possible or part of the...
Of course, it's possible. I would say we have a lot to learn from social sciences. If we're thinking about science to support public policies, who best to ask about what the public needs? So I would say even not just about the impact of science, but from the very beginning when we have to define what the research program or plan will be for a societal benefit. That's where we need to engage better with the social scientists. Are we doing it? A bit. Are we doing it enough? No, certainly not. I'm quite hopeful that bringing the 3 granting councils together and having them develop a vision that is more holistic, that we will follow suit and also incorporate the social sciences at the very beginning. There's so much to learn. And we haven't even talked about the different knowledge systems that we are now opening up to and considering indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, call it what you want. It's different social values that we need to incorporate into decisions. The the same way we incorporate science, physical, natural sciences. So again, in that field, a lot to learn from social sciences et toute la démarche qu'ils ont fait. A lot to say about anthropology, by the way.
So I think that one of the issues potentially with incorporating social science into policymaking is that a lot of the knowledge in the social sciences is not necessarily quantitative in the same way that it is with the natural sciences. It does not mean that it's not rigorous or that it's not academic or that it's not analytical, but it's often not quantitative. And so I think that can mean that it can be more easily dismissed. It's hard to get around a satellite map when you can see that the ice sheets are retreating. I mean, you can't deny that information, but I think it's a lot easier to dismiss social scientist findings because they're often not quantitative, but I definitely want to say that does not mean they're not rigorous or academic.
Can I just add one more thing?
Yes.
I'll just, because for me, if I could summarize my diatribe into something really simple, scientists are really good at answering the question, can we? Social scientists are critical to help us understand, should we?
That's good.
And I'd also like to add not just social scientists, but also philosophers and ethicists. There's a lot of,
Let's include the humanities.
yes, absolutely.
Okay, I'd like to throw it open to you, if you have any questions. I don't know if there's a microphone format. There is? Oh, first question, sorry. All right, say it nice and loudly, and I will repeat it, because there isn't a microphone that I can see.
Camille Lieber from University of Ontario Institute of Technology. Having served in the provincial government as Assistant Deputy Minister for Research and Science Advisor for a short time, I can relate to some of the issues that you're talking about. I would like to zoom on one issue in particular, which I found very difficult, which is the culture, the clash of the two cultures. And just to be more specific, you already mentioned some of those differences. The pace is different. The objectives are different. Scientists would like to figure out what's going on and take their time to do so, while politicians want to make decisions and make them quickly. Confidentiality. Scientists go around the world and they publish their work and they talk about their work, while government perhaps would like to retain some of that information for some time to achieve perhaps an upper hand. And of course, the biggest one that I found is the interdependency. Scientists would like to do their own thing. Just give me the money and leave me alone. I can figure out the solution to the problem I'm tackling, while government, of course, would like to have control where the money is going and the return on investment. My question to you three, as defined by the former New Zealand chief scientist, Sir Peter Gluckman, as an honest broker, how are you going to close that gap of culture? What are practical means that you kind of developed or you're thinking about that will allow to close this huge, huge gap in culture?
It's all yours.
First off, we have to agree that there is a large gap in culture. Not so sure it's as large as it used to be. I don't see how this is any different than talking about diversity and bridging different cultures in anything we do. It starts with better understanding the person you're interacting with, and an open conversation and listening to what others have to say. So really important is to zoom in quickly on the needs of the other person, individual, organization that you are in a conversation with, right? We don't all have the same needs. So that helps bridge the culture gaps, understanding who's coming to the table, what each actor wants and is bringing to the table.
Would it be fair to add, too, it's a shared understanding of the role?
Exactly.
Right? I
It
mean,
is a shared understanding.
different roles that different people are playing in the political decision-making system. Is that a fair way of framing it?
Yep, that's a fair way of framing it.
Okay.
Maybe I'll add one thing. So I used to spend a lot of time negotiating things. And someone once described my negotiating style as, Dan seems to agree with you until you've changed your mind. And it's a tactic, and it's really important to play this facilitative role from our position. You know, to the extent that we see that there's a gap, a cultural gap, part of what we need to do is to actually find those, and on the Venn diagram, those points of agreement where there's some overlap. And once you start getting people to agree on something, then that's the basis from which you can start to explore on those things where there's a divergence of views and to look for ways to either compromise or manage it in some other way. So I think the facilitative role in managing those cultural discussions is something that we should be able to do.
So I'd also like to push back a little bit on the discussion of culture. For example, confidentiality. So every academic who's in a university has had to keep their mouth shut at some point. So I think that that's a little bit of a caricature of the way that that researchers actually operate. We serve on committees where the discussion is confidential. We referee papers, and that's a confidential process. And all of that sort of thing, that's an integral part of the academic community. So I think part of the issue is that there's kind of maybe a stereotypical role when you're not a part of a community of how things actually work. And I'm not going to talk trash about what happens in the government, but it goes both ways. People without the experience of living in those different worlds tend to caricature them, and they think that the culture is actually farther apart than it really is. So one of the, I think one of the really important things is you actually have people who go between those worlds and you trade. You can imagine doing, sending people out into academia, into companies. I mean, it's internships for grown-ups. It's really fun to go into a different culture and learn a new world and get new ideas and interact with people who don't think the way you do. And it's a growth opportunity. So I think that's something that should really be encouraged.
Thank you. We have one over there. Just wait 1 second. He's going to.
I'm really glad you mentioned the social sciences, and I think our science advisors were a little shy. The CSA and NRC and NRCan do strategic planning? Yes or no?
Sorry, what was the question again?
Strategic planning.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you do consultations?
Of course.
Do you do program evaluation? Do you do training? Do you do communications? And do you do facilitation? Those are all social science. Communications is even humanities. So I think why you think you don't do social science is because you're thinking of academics. The people who do all those things are staff or consultants, people who bid on projects. But the social sciences are very active in what you do. And I think it's a misperception because your natural science oriented departments to make that you think you don't do social science or rely on social science. You may not rely on academic social scientists, but all the consultants and staff that are doing those things for you, we're all trained there.
Any response? No?
Yes,
No,
thanks for adding that. Specifically, I guess our mind was set on the functions of science planning and science programming per se and integrating that more than, but you're absolutely correct. And, Natural Resources Canada is consulting every day, and you all read about it in the news, so I'll leave it at that.
But we're sort of caught, aren't we? And I think this is
Yeah.
what you may be driving at a bit of a sort of institutional paradigm,
Yeah.
right? Where we are thinking of institutions of government, of academe, or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think the intervention there is suggesting there's a different way of maybe thinking about it. Is that perhaps,
Yeah.
anyway? Yes, Mr. Manning.
Yeah, this conversation started with, is this working? It's working okay? With how do you get government to value science? And it seems to me one of the answers to be given here is get them to value evidence-based decision-making. But it seems to me that what the science community means by evidence-based decision-making and what politicians understand by that phrase is different. And the question I'm working towards is how can we get some common ground on that? For example, it seems to me that when scientists talk about this, that they imply there is a body of evidence that supports a particular policy position, and you should follow it. The politician thinks there are bodies of evidence that support several different options, often contradictory. This is particularly true of a politician that has a legal background, because their conception of evidence-based decision-making comes from the court system, where the Crown presents one set of evidence, the defense presents another, and the challenge is to sort out between them. The second thing with a politician often feels that we're presented with incomplete evidence. And so there is evidence there, but is it complete? And for example, in trying to balance find the right balance between environmental conservation and economic development, there's an enormous amount of evidence being provided to the government now on what are the environmental impacts of this particular economic activity. There's not so much evidence presented as what is the economic impact of the environmental conservation measures that are being proposed. So I think there's different conceptions here of what constitutes evidence-based decision-making. And I wonder if the panel could suggest how can we work towards some common understanding of that, which, if it could be arrived at, would enhance evidence-based decision-making.
So let me have a stab at not answering the question. And I'm gonna not answer it in this way, Preston. I think that's that we also need to understand that when scientists say something as a fact, they don't actually say it's a fact that is constrained by a lot of things, which happens to be the experiments that were done. And so ultimately, and scientists might really hate me for this, it's still opinion. And so a fact is constrained by the parameters of the work that was done. And so I think it's a little arrogant if I were to say, as a scientist, to say this is an immutable fact. I mean, gravity is a law, and we elevate things that we feel are facts that are irrefutable to laws. So they're laws of thermodynamics. But much of what we do in observational science is there is an explanation that is consistent with the information that I have. And the scientific community, if you go to a conference, I might swear that this is a fact, and I will be butting heads with someone at a conference who says, well, I got some different evidence from a different way of doing this, and I see the world differently. So I think we need to be a little careful as scientists about recognizing the limitations of the evidence that we present. And so there may well be more than one body of scientific evidence for any issue that arises. And so it's complicated. And so what we do is we give an opinion which is based on the best available information that we have at this time, although we never have that disclaimer at the bottom of the page that we send in. So that's how I would see it. And so it's part of an ongoing conversation, and scientific evidence is never perfect, and other forms of evidence which are not science that go into forming a policy are also not perfect.
If I can follow up on that, there's something we have not touched on yet. It's, are we really good at ensuring that the science advice is there at the very beginning of policy development? Well, we've talked about integrating and how we're getting better at that. Are we doing okay on ensuring the science is at the table from the very beginning? I would say no, and that's because of the different pace. And when we are able to ensure every time we think of a new policy option for government, a new regulation, a new rule, that we have science at the table so that they understand, the science community understands the context and can bring in, okay, so here's my evidence that I'm bringing, but here are the margins of error or the limits of what we know and what we do not know. So that then that piece of policy advice that will be given has incorporated the science to the extent that the science does have, to the extent of the limits of the science, because there's, for the scientists in the room, we all know this, science never ends. Tomorrow there will be another answer, but if we integrate both at the very beginning, and that goes with the relationships, right? Building relationships from the very beginning. Then you can integrate those margins of error. You can have a conversation with the scientist or the science community on, here's where we want to go, does that make sense? Oh, maybe not because of the science. We know. Okay, so then maybe we should pull it back, bring it a bit more there. So I think, I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but it is something we had not addressed quite yet. And it is, do we really feel that the science evidence or the science advice that is in the federal departments or elsewhere, is it at the table as early as possible as we could? For the benefit of Canadians, I would say not quite. We still have work to do.
We could have a sidebar on, because there's a philosophical, epistemological question that I'm sure Eric would be more than happy to go into. So how do we know what we know is a really important question that we struggle with as scientists.
Well, it's also, sorry, isn't it also partly a question of expectations? Like,
What do you mean?
Well, so I would argue that what Mr. Manning is suggesting is that you have to understand the drivers of political decision-making, the fact that there are trade-offs, there are looking for solutions that are, the notes I made were kind of fast, affordable, and doable. It really doesn't matter if I'm right or not 100%, but my point being that that is a different world, and it is a totally legitimate one. And I think what was behind that question was kind of the notion of, does science understand that that is the world we are living in, of trade-offs, solutions, affordability, and so on, and is why I really liked what you were saying, because you were really arguing this is about feeding into the policy process. It's not about owning it and saying, because I've given you something, therefore, point now we stop. And I think that's part of this, helping to respond to expectations and maybe set them a bit. Does that make any sense?
Yes, makes sense.
Well, that's nice to know. Thank you. Anybody? Yes, we have one over there.
Hi.
There's someone
So
over
I'm
there
one
that
of
had
them,
a while.
social scientists.
We sure opened the gate there,
but
didn't
I
we?
do want to, one day I said to John Nubley, you need the universities because we have the social scientists that you don't have. And he said to me, pardon me? StatsCan, Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada, EDSC. There are a lot of social sciences done in the government. And that's why it would be interesting and important for everybody to work with some of the government social scientists, but equally interesting for them to create partnerships with universities in order to access the perhaps larger number of social scientists that are in universities. I mean, I think the other thing is, if you just think about environmental issues, even if you think about space issues, you have to figure out human behavior. So you need social psychologists working with you. And we have policy scholars in universities. These are people whose research is on policy and what makes for sound policy. So those people could be very informative to government as well. And they are. I mean, I think a number of them do inform the policy of government. They're not policy makers, but they're knowledgeable about policy, perhaps in ways that some policy makers are not. And finally, the great thing about French is social sciences and humanities are referred to as les sciences humaines.
So I have a couple of questions here, and one way over there, but we need to, could I ask you to sort of put up your hand so the microphone can get to you before? So I have
she's had her hand up for a while.
Quite a long
this
time.
young
I think
lady
we should-
over here.
we
So
should
do you
go
mind if we
outside.
start with her?
I have a list of people.
Do you? Okay, so I'll let you go and organize that. Thank you.
Is this working? My name is Marae. I'm a PhD student from the University of Toronto. I want to ask a fairly specific question. on something that I have the impression has so far been quite an elephant in the room, and that is climate change. And Canada is a country that is largely based on the extraction of fossil fuels. We all know that we need to shift our energy economy towards one that is neutral, that is sustainable. So far, we do not have a concrete government strategy to move beyond this, one that would actually meet the targets of the Paris Climate Agreement, despite really living in an era of being like this is a very pro-science government currently. Much of the public discourse has been limited to talking about whether you're pro or anti-carbon tax. We know that this alone isn't a policy that will actually meet the targets, even if it's implemented properly. So my question to you, and I think this is one you should be able to answer, is...
Such high expectations.
Sorry, this is very loaded, but are you satisfied with the roles of your agency in developing Canada's climate change policy so far?
You want to start that one? I mean, it's about...
I think this is
So
you.
it's just
Throw you
a-
on
Without
the
getting,
bus
I will ask all three to respond, but I must admit, when I hear that, I mean, the challenge I would argue you're probably facing, it's the relationship between, and this is your public service versus the political decision makers, who will set out a political agenda on climate change, right? And we're back again to this question of the science relationship in terms of either driving or responding to it. If I were to frame it that way, is that kind of where you're going? Because I think you got to put that in the context. It's not your policy, it's the policy of the government, elected government. And so I think the question has to be answered within that context. You want to give it a try?
Yeah,
Just yes or no.
I can give it a try. Quite honestly, I would say I'm quite satisfied with the work that Natural Resources Canada is doing to support this issue. You can read our minister's mandate letter. It's all about ensuring innovation in the natural resource sectors, and it goes through energy efficiencies and trying to drive energy efficiencies in the natural resource sector. So we are looking into it, and I can say that all scientists within Natural Resources Canada that are working on one aspect or another of climate change, including scientists from the forestry sector that are looking at the carbon budget with respect to the forests, as one example. Other scientists in our CanMet Materials Lab in Hamilton are working to develop new lighter alloys towards energy efficiency. Folks in our Varennes lab are working on solar panels and more energy efficiency. So in the context of our minister's mandate, I would say certainly I am satisfied as chief scientist, and I do know that scientists that are working on issues that relate to the Pan-Canadian framework and climate change are working hard, and their work is valued.
So I'm just punting a little bit because I haven't been in my job long enough to answer your question in an intelligent way. But what I will say is the government is certainly very actively engaged in gathering the data that they need to evaluate what's happening. And so certainly the Earth observations community, if you look at what the observables are, for example, of the different aerosols in the atmosphere, I mean, they're keeping track of them and they're gathering the data they need so they can evaluate the state of the climate and how it's changing. So that is certainly something that is actively being pursued.
So let me tell you how things work. And I think the way things work at NRC is probably very similar to the way it would work in any department. I just want to, because you may not be familiar, when the government announces a policy, which can appear as a separate policy statement or quite often in a budget, the first thing that happens is that the senior executives in the department meet and they have a very deep discussion about how this actually changes what we're doing now. So at NRC, the agenda of this government, including the policies that have been announced around climate change, have had profound impacts on the investment strategy that we have for the different types of projects. And there is tremendous reinforcement by the executives and the senior managers at NRC to make sure that the staff understand and are connected to what those should be. So there really is, now I think if there's anything lacking, it is the concerted cross-government effort to pool all of our knowledge and capabilities together to really collectively address the problem. But I am sure that in each department, whenever there's a policy statement, including and especially climate change, that each of us are looking very carefully at how our current activities and how we are investing our resources are helping the government to deliver on its agenda.
Well, thank you. Interesting, since I'm a climate scientist, but I'm going to avoid that question. Well, I was actually the Assistant Deputy Minister and the Minister's advisor in the Kyoto Protocol negotiations, but that's for my memoirs, which I haven't written yet, which you'll hear about. No, I did want to go back to the general question, because the titles of the three of you are science advisors. You're not, well, no, you're not, but chief scientist, sorry.
I'm off the hook.
Or whatever it is, the title. I'm sorry, Donna. I know you're in NRCan, as we call it. Anyway, I spent 6 years as an ADM in Environment Canada in the 90s, and I've been running around in other things ever since. But I think the important thing is that the role of scientists, and I include the social scientists. If you're not aware, as I talked about this morning, well, I know you weren't here this morning, Sarah, when we had, this
I had a
afternoon.
good
But anyway,
reason.
we have merged internationally the International Social Science Council with the International Council for Science to create the International All Sciences Council, because it is very important that we bring together the economists with the psychologists, with the physicists, the chemists, for addressing, if you want to, so I'll bring in climate change for an example, the biggest uncertainty on the climate in 2100, and that global temperature change is not the natural sciences part. That's about that big a difference. But the difference between what society, through its economics, political, sociology, culture, pick as the emission scenario is this big. It's 2 to 3 times larger uncertainty in what you might call the policy natural sciences thing. But anyway, going back to the more general, the specific question. In my time as a science advisor, I felt my role was not to tell the minister the policy should be this, but to give the minister his or her advice as to if you go this way, then the natural scientists say, just as a weather, I was responsible for the Weather Service, among other things. So, okay, we could spend another $1 billion a year getting more satellites to observe the weather to the nearest micron, and we could give out a warning, there's a tornado coming. The reality is half the people don't even hear it, and of the half that do hear it, 50% of them decide for economic, social, cultural, whatever background reasons, how they will respond to it. And we have to understand that in a way we factor in to the pros and cons of certain decisions that are made by policymakers. The same way as choosing the place of, say, in environment, chemistry kind of things. I said I was co-chairing with an ADM of Health Canada, the Committee on Air Quality Standards. I said, our job is not to say the standard should be 50 parts per million. The standard, what we should say to the minister is 50 parts per million will give you this social, economic, and health benefits, importantly, but it will cost you this amount economic to make it happen. 40, 50, 60, 70, these are the various numbers. Anyway.
So the question is?
The important question is, to me, is how do you not deal with that issue, but how do you deal with the need to be fully involved in an integrated, ongoing process? It's not a case of you suddenly being called into the office and say, I need an answer to this question. We need to have a process, which, quite frankly, not all politicians will agree to, but nonetheless, involving it. And we need to involve the stakeholders. We have a program called Future Earth, and we're calling it Co-Designing the Science Program. So we don't just have a group of scientists design the science program. We have the policy people, stakeholders, and others as part of the process. How do we make that? How can you play a role, you three characters? And sorry, I'm not sure what you are, Toby.
I don't play any role, don't worry about it.
Okay. Anyway, how could we make a role so that you have that interactive, ongoing, back and forth kind of role so that you can listen and discuss with ministers, or more likely with the deputy minister
All right,
or the policy advisor in the minister's
Let's get Donna to
office.
start, and we'll just go down the line.
I think it's part, I touched on this before, it's part of an ongoing conversation. So in our department at Natural Resources Canada, we have what we call the Science and Technology Board that all executive committee sits on, the deputy minister, the chief scientist, and the senior executives, where we have those conversations on the policy agenda and the science we're doing that are facilitated by my office. That goes miles for bringing the science. So we compile all the information on what we're doing in a specific area, and we'll bring that to the table so we're aware of what the science is, and then we talk about how should we position our science in the future, the midterm, to support. So it's the ongoing conversations that we have, different ways of ensuring those happen at Natural Resources Canada. Of course, the deputy is there. The deputy is one of the best champions of science and policy integration I've ever seen. So, she knows who to tap into on those science. But they are ongoing conversations at a high level on science.
So at the space So at the Space Agency, there's not a lot of internal scientific expertise. So the different departments, the different directorates have external advisory committees that are drawn from the community, largely the academic community, and also other departments in the government that I am going to be participating in. So I will see how those function, and so I can understand that much better. And then I've also been integrated into the decision-making boards very rapidly. All of a sudden I have a lot more meetings to go to. And so that's something that clearly the Space Agency is really invested in, having that scientific integration on both ends, both where you're getting the advice and the decision-making in the lower levels of the organization, and also at the very highest levels. So it's something that's definitely a priority for the agency.
I guess my instinct is to say, you actually just described the job.
Yeah.
And so that is the job. The job is to assemble information, to provide advice, to provide recommendations when asked. And when you provide recommendations or advice, there's usually some kind of options or consequence issues that go along with it. And if we're doing our jobs, we provide fulsome advice to those who have to make decisions, so that they should know, if you do this, here are the potential consequences. If you go this way, here are the other consequences. And most of the time they're dealing with dilemmas where there isn't a right or wrong. There is seeking the least ill effect.
So we are about at the end. I'd just like to ask each of the panelists to give us a very quick answer to a question that I think is really what we've been talking about. We all want the political world to be able to make good decisions. And so if you had one piece of advice to give to anyone in this room about how they could work more effectively to support political decision-making, what would you recommend? And Dan, we're going to start with you.
Great. Is anyone going for dinner soon? The one piece of advice, well, I guess from my point of view, this is my way of actually delaying answering while I'm actually assembling an answer. But I think it's actually important to make sure that when you give advice, that there isn't an agenda. That if there's a difference between giving advice and trying to influence. And if you're actually trying to influence, you will be less credible. If you appear to be trying to influence, you'll be less credible to those listening. I think it's really important that you approach it from that perspective of this is arm's length advice. I don't have a stake in this. And that's why I said earlier that as soon as I start to feel like I think I know what the policy should be, I have to stop. I have to get out. It's not my job.
Okay. Sarah.
So I think that one piece of advice is that I think as an advisor, you actually spend most of the time listening, listening to the people who have the scientific knowledge to contribute to the conversation, and then also listening to the person who's asking for your advice to understand the facets of what they're trying to do. Because as the advisor, you don't have all of the information, but you do have access to a particular type of information that's incredibly valuable, and you can serve as the interpreter to make sure that that information is translated so that it is available for decision making.
One piece of advice. Realizing that we have different people in the audience, I would say support open science and science literacy in Canada. That's it.
So, let me say thank you to all three panelists. Maybe to right, Donna Kirkwood, who is the Chief Scientist at NRCan, Sarah Gallagher, the first Chief Science Advisor at the Canadian Space Agency, and Dan Wayner, who was recently appointed Chief Science Advisor for the NRC. And thank you all for participating and for your contribution, and enjoy the rest of the evening. Way to go. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you.
So on behalf of CSPC, we just want to thank the panelists once more for their insightful panel. And as a gift to the panel and to all the panelists, CSPC has made a donation to the Ingenium Foundation's Adopt a Class program at the Canadian Science and Technology Museum. This will allow underprivileged students in Ottawa the chance to enjoy hands-on science learning experience at the museum. With this, we actually conclude day one of CSPC. However, if any one of you wants more, there is a pub night party at the Rector Lounge starting at 9:30 p.m. So those of you who are not done, you can continue on. You are all welcome and you are all invited. Please note that we begin again tomorrow at 7:45 a.m. with a breakfast session, followed by a plenary that will begin at 8:30 a.m. Thank you all for attending CSPC Day 1, and we all look forward to seeing you again tomorrow.